Thank you, thank you. Second day of presentation, so I guess a bit of fatigue has set in. Hope I will give you enough to think about without making it too heavy. I want to thank, obviously, Debbie and James for having me here. It's quite an honor. And this is on games as conceptual tools, as you can read on the slide. So, who am I? Very quickly, I have a few slides about that, so bear with me, but I think it all comes beautifully together towards the end. I used to be a game designer for the industry starting from the 90s. My first commercial game, in a team of which I was part, dates back to 1995, and I worked on some other games like point-and-click adventures and some other games that you've never heard about for about 12 years about. I also worked on slightly larger teams, but not as a game designer mainly, or as an advisor, say, or in quality assurance. You might have heard of some of these games. And then, okay, so somebody likes Jack Sparrow, you, okay. I didn't like it very much. Maybe it's me, or maybe the fact that, I don't know, I found working in the industry very taxing, sometimes repetitive, and at least going back to the early 2000s, crunch was still a big part of what you would do in the industry, and I wasn't very happy about that. So I decided to do an unpopular thing, which is leave the industry and go back to academia, which was not well received by my, as you can imagine, family and friends, who see, I have a career that is sort of future-oriented, perhaps. There's prospects, is tech-adjacent, so maybe that's not such a great idea to leave it to go back to read the Greeks and the Germans, right? So I wasn't popular in that period, no. However, I didn't see it quite that way. I thought the two were not as apart from one another, the two worlds, that of academia and game development, as my family thought. In fact, I went back to academia to get my PhD in philosophy, hoping to use, say, philosophy to understand games a little better. There are several aspects that might be useful. But also, coming from the industry, I could have used my game development skills maybe to contribute to philosophy somehow, to make redigest some old problems, maybe give rise to new ones. As a matter of fact, I think that's mostly the reason why I was invited here, because I try to use game development to aid philosophy somehow, which is what this talk is about. To conclude my presentation very quickly, I live and work in Malta, which is a tiny little island in the Mediterranean. The climate is very different from this island, and you can tell from my skin that, yeah, also the amount of sunshine we get is a bit different. By the way, we are open for exchanges and visiting positions, and we get 3 or 4 people visiting every semester. So if you think that we have something to offer, I can see Alina up there. If you think we have something to offer as a group, maybe you can read us up. We're one of the, 4 or 5 big research groups in Europe, and we're very welcoming and friendly and so on. I also work in the US, but that's shameful and I don't want to talk about it. All right, so as I said, one of the reasons why I'm probably invited here, I'm guessing, is that I make quirky little games that have a philosophical point sometimes. And this is some of the things I'm going to talk to you about. You can see a website here. That's not the only website where you can find games. I made a few others that you might have heard about, like something soup something, which somehow made it to Kotaku, or the game of Here. I'm mentioning these things because if you teach game design, or if you think about the expressive potential of games and have seminars with students and so on and so forth, there are people around the world, my friends and colleagues, that teach those kind of things, that use those that are free games that are playable in a browser and very short, normally between 10 minutes and 25 minutes, depending on the game, as playable homework or conversation starters during seminars and so on and so forth. They are free, they are easy to play, they're accessible, so the only thing you have to lose by trying them out is your time to figure out, this doesn't work for me, or it's not what I thought it was, and so on. So my suggestion, there's like 6 or 7, and there's one coming out this year, that you check them out and maybe use them in class. They are free teaching materials that you can use. To conclude my presentation for the 3rd time, I'm also a regular kind of academic that for a living writes books and more books. This is the one I was talking to you about, yeah, today, yeah. This one will come up later, then I also write fiction and then more stuff and more stuff. They will come back later. So I'm also credible to a degree as an academic proper, okay. So I would like to start on this idea that games can be conceptual tools. And I already know that that is not going to cause a controversy, in a sense that you're all here because you think that games can, in a way, do some stuff. And stuff that is important, for example, in the case of, say, educational games, right? Like, you've heard about it, many of you are working on it. It's not something that's going to raise anybody's eyebrows within this group here. So what is this exactly? Well, I wrote a paper about one of the games I wrote and about how that can be considered to be a work of, I don't know, conceptual work, let's call it. What do I mean by that? Well, I wanted to try to express the idea that games can teach us and communicate stuff, they're expressive media, but not necessarily in the direction of, let's say, in Super Mario, there's this notion that a green mushroom is an item that offers an extra life, that's right. So this is a convention, there's a game asset that does something within the game environment. The knowledge that a green mushroom means an extra life is not useful outside of the, let's say, epistemic context of Super Mario, right? I cannot use it in my everyday life. So I'm trying to think of ways in which knowledge and ideas can be communicated to players in a way that they affect who they are and what they do in the real world, not limited to the game, as I said, epistemic context. And I mentioned already, not a problem. We use educational games all the time. This is how many of us will get European, sorry, I said European, that's a bad word here. Let's say regular funding, not European at all. Right. Educational games are not the only ways in which games can communicate ideas to us willingly. To begin with, for example, the work of Mary Flanagan by herself in other texts and with Helen Nissenbaum on this one, claim that even games that do not want to communicate ideas are still imbibed with social and cultural ideologies to the point that they communicate to us even when they don't want to. When they don't want to, we tend to call them ideology, when this is implicit and tacit, and we call them game design values when they're explicit on the forefront of the experience. If you read any of Ian Bogost's work on persuasion and persuasive game, similar idea. So games can, through how the, for example, affordances are set, the goals are prepared for the player, and the interactions are regulated by the game designers, they can invite certain behavior, promote certain attitudes, communicate certain ideas. So what I'm trying to communicate today is not particularly new, right? I mentioned educational games, ideological games, values designed into games, games designed to be persuasive. So nothing particularly new or shocking. What I'm trying to do is like try to explain the same idea or a complementary idea from a different angle, that of the conceptual works. Hopefully that like completes the horizon rather than, in a way, proposing a revolution or an innovative little thing. And when I talk about conceptual works, I'm also talking about conceptual art as one of the, say, most frequent places where these kind of things are found. And since I'm talking to a group of, I presume, computer scientists and PhDs in AI and people interested in human-computer interaction, I will not take for granted that you know what I'm talking about when I say something like conceptual art, right? So there's a little couple of slides about that one so that we can be on the same battleground, let's say. Ready to go? Or are you bored already? Okay, that's good. Okay. What you see here is a picture of Emily Shellekens, who's a leading scholar in philosophy, meaning you will certainly not know her, working on yeah, we're not very popular, right? Our groups, like if you think about it, when you go to a philosophy conference, like probably you're, I don't know, 100 people, maybe 1,000 in Europe. Like, so this is like a very small conference for your field. Like in AI, like there's hundreds of thousands of researchers working at the same time. So we're not very popular at the moment, and cuts are being made. I don't know if you heard, especially to the humanities and philosophy, with a particular cruelty, I think. Anyway, she's not very popular to begin with, now even less, but she is a scholar who talks about aesthetics and theories on art. In particular, she's focusing on conceptual art as a movement that it's quite recent. We could talk about modernism and postmodernism, which is different if you think about it from, say, Renaissance art or, let's say, expressionistic cinema, in the sense that in this particular current, what matters is not really something that is aesthetically relevant to the object. For example, its beauty, its proportions, how pleasant something is. Neither, and also something that doesn't matter is the mastery required for producing it. So the value of a work of art doesn't emerge from how difficult it is to craft, right? Sometimes we give values to, or the object, or the material it's made with, like a golden vase has a certain value for that reason. So she says, we started to see, starting from mid-previous century, that we can create art that is not really about the aesthetical value or the mastery in making it, but rather they're about the ideas that they communicate, right? It's kind of a more communicative side to the history of art. I know it's kind of vague and confusing at the moment to say like, well, the object doesn't really matter. It's not really about the emotion or the feeling of it, but it's about the ideas it communicates. So, to make the point even clearer, I'm going to use an example that she brings up from in the same paper that is quoted at the end. I have a list of references. If you're interested, we can share that. But again, not popular. I'm repeating myself. And the examples that she brings up has to do with chairs, in particular, these kind of chairs. I don't know if you can see well from the screen, but this is a kind of a picture, a frontal picture of an installation. This installation dated to 1965, and it's by an American artist called Joseph Kossuth. It's called 1 and 3 Chairs, right? Consists of a generic, like foldable wooden chair, a picture of the same chair as installed in the let's say performance or installation, and a dictionary definition on the other side of the original chair, taken from a local dictionary. Why I'm mentioning local dictionary? Well, the artist was not even involved in the production of this installation. He just gave instruction to their assistants so that they will be able to build it anywhere around the world. This is quite common in conceptual art. They sometimes don't even do the things. They just write instructions, somebody will do it, right? In this case, for example, they said, get a local chair from the venue, wherever that is, that chair could have worked, take a picture, put it on the side, and then wherever you are in Poland or Sweden, wherever, take a dictionary definition, any dictionary, doesn't matter, but in the language where that is installed, and put it on its right. And so walking around a museum and encountering this installation, one might start to become curious and ask themselves questions like, what's the meaning of this, right? Ideally, one could say, well, the title seems to suggest that it's about chair given, I mean, reaching us or being given to us in 3 different fashions. We have let's say, an actual chair to sit on, functionally working as a chair. We have a representation of a chair, and we have an abstract definition of a chair, right? So is this a chair giving me in 3 different venues? Or maybe like, what's chairness about, what's the chairness of a chair? Is a chair because I can sit on it, but it's a single individual? Or it's a definition, a more like chair-like thing because it in a way includes all the chairs, right? In case you studied philosophy, you probably see that this is sort of a nod to Plato's theory of the forms, like what's chair, what's the ideal chair, and so on and so forth. You don't need to have studied that thing to become curious about what's going on here and to have hypotheses about what the message is here. According to Schellekens, this is kind of interesting because instead of providing a message, it sort of incites a message or maybe asks implicitly a question that you experientially, as part of the audience, can elaborate upon. It's almost like a materialized thought experiment, or maybe like an experience that is meant to stimulate very precise kind of questions. She also thinks that this kind of experience and this subjective value that you attach to your intuitions and your thoughts about this one represents a different kind of knowledge than knowledge that I would pass to you like passively or abstractly, right? This is on the spot. This is you dealing with this stuff and coming up with your own answers. She sees in that the value of conceptual art. My students then go like, okay, yeah, that's all good and everything. However, you cannot say that this piece of work here communicates an idea and other pieces of art do not. Like take, for example, Hans Holbein's portrait of Henry VIII, right? You could easily claim that, look how wealthy and large and frontal and like, I mean, obviously there's a message here that our king is powerful and large and wealthy and, I mean, it's a display of hierarchy and power, right? Okay, and this one here, like, of course, the representation, the piece of work here, the sculpture here is trying to communicate to us that probably, I suppose, our Lord Jesus Christ died for our sins, right? Those are ideas that are communicated by some things that allegedly are two works of art. According to Schellekens, they do not qualify as conceptual works because she thinks those are just notions, right? They are not intellectually relevant ideas. So for a piece of work to be conceptually relevant, they need to communicate, to be a conceptual work, it needs to communicate something that is intellectually relevant. And you might be like, what is intellectual relevance? Is my PhD intellectually relevant? Perhaps. So Schellekens, being trained as a philosopher, knows better than to get into that kind of discussion. So she does not quite put definite boundaries around what is and what isn't intellectually relevant. But she gives some clues in her work. For example, she says, it is intellectually relevant, a work, your PhD maybe, when they present a socio-political criticism, maybe with sarcasm or a reflection on the state that we're in. So for a piece of art to be conceptually relevant, it might be so because it criticizes the status quo or a certain political orientation or social phenomenon. It might be so when it presents a philosophical idea, such as, for example, Plato's theory of the forms, as we just saw. Or it might be intellectually relevant when it presents a self-reflexive point. This is very interesting. So, for example, for a work of art to present a self-reflexive point would be to, in a way, incarnate questions about what is art, what is artsy about art, what's the role of the artist in the production of art, and so on. I'll make an example. I'm fond of examples. This is a very famous picture of Urinal, which is a work installation by Marcel Duchamp. And what you see here is essentially a common industrially produced urinal, just tilted on its side and presented within an art gallery. If you walked in a gallery next to the chairs and past the chairs and walk up to this one, obviously, like, this is a provocation of some kind. It's asking implicit questions, such as, how is this a work of art? I could have bought it and done the same. Is this a work of art because it's tilted on its side and not used in its normal context, that is hanging from the wall in a bathroom? Or loo, whatever you want to call it. Is this a piece of art because somebody signed it and gave it that status? Is this considered to be a piece of art because somebody, an enlightened mind, decided to put it in a gallery and institutionally accept this as a work of art? Right? This, walking just by this piece here, asks those kind of questions that are not necessarily answered by the work in question, but is definitely like a provocation to thinking. I mentioned again that in philosophy we talk about those kind of things as thought experiments, right? A situation that helps you to think through certain intellectually relevant ideas. According to Schellekens, to do art in this way is doing art theory through art pieces. Am I making sense here? Is this clear why this might be a self-reflexive piece? Its conceptual communication has to do with what is art, the status of this object, the relationship with the artist, and so on and so forth. I promise that this is enough and we switch into games soon. So just bear with me. Right? This was all preparation, well, foreplay. Obviously, where I'm going with this is that games can have a similar relationship with the audience. So can we try to communicate intellectually relevant ideas to our audience via games? And I'm going to present a few answers and a few examples by which I believe that to be the case. So I'm talking about conceptual games. Here's one. You might know Nicky Case, very prolific trends designer of games that are normally small and used to explain certain phenomena. In this case, the phenomenon that she wants to explain through this particular gameplay is zoning in modern cities. So what she does is that she does a bunch of studying and then distills the, say, social phenomena that underlie zoning and the effects of zoning into an interactive little game. It's called Parable of the Polygons because there's going to be 3 polygons representing 3 different populations and so on. So it can be identified as a conceptual game because it talks about social political phenomena and it takes a position about those phenomena. Its design serves the interactive explanation of phenomena like social segregation and structural racism in modern cities. This game is both conceptual and also on the rhetorical side, similar to the tree game that we've seen yesterday. So it comes from a certain perspective on the problem, and it tries to guide via setting particular goals and particular affordances the path to the path of the player to understanding that in a way that is rhetorical, meaning that all players will naturally go from point A, having to understand the game, to point B, having accepted that if those are the rules of modern living, then probably we should make cities in a particular fashion. And we're not doing it right now. So there's a social criticism and a rhetorical point that she's trying to make. If you're interested in games of this kind, there's many on the website of Nicky Case, including about how trust works as a social token and so on and so forth. Have you heard about the evolution of trust as a experimental game? Okay. So this one has also that kind of, differently from maybe the conceptual works of art, as I told you, this has a rhetorical goal. So it's set up to present a certain point. I'm going to show you a conceptual game that instead remains on the vague, sort of subjective experiential questions. And this game is one that I made called Something Something Soup Something. And the game takes place in a futuristic kitchen. You can see there's some great weird equipment, and the kitchen is very lonely because we don't cook foods in kitchens anymore. That is because the cost of labor and the cost of the resources to cooking is too high on planet Earth. Therefore, we outsource our cooking to aliens, right? So where the cost of work is very, very low. So the only worker in the kitchen, you, has the task of actually having the food beamed down to Earth and serving it to the humans upstairs. All good and dandy, apart from the fact that the aliens do not know what soups are. So they send a bunch of stuff. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, and our goal, as the worker in this kitchen, is sort of in a Tinder of soups, right? Decide whether the unique plates that are sent to us can be served to humans as soups or cannot be served to soup. So can we discard it or can we serve it? And these soups come in various formats. They might be solid, they might be liquid, they might be bubbly, they might be not served in a traditional container like a hat, for example. Or they might not come with the right utensils. It might come with some poisonous substances in it. So after about 20 decisions of that kind, the game stops and says, well, your turn is over, and spits back to the player a definition of what they understand as edible soup. So in this case, we don't have a rhetorical position towards game, meaning that the designer is not necessarily telling us, this is what soup is, please accept that through gameplay. To proceed, you need to accept my vision of soup. Rather, it's a series of interactions that eventually spit back a subjective point of view on what soup is and invites the player to go on the website and see like where they stand within the curves of what soups mean. You might be kind of stupefied I was when I traveled around Europe to figure out what categories, linguistic categories of soups applied to, rather were applied by different populations. For example, I figured out that in Poland, if there's Polish people in the audience, no? Okay. Having soups that are milk-based is quite common. Whereas for most of the other population, milk-based sort of dinners is cereals, right? You don't call it soup. Or maybe, for example, if you are from Spain, and I know there's a couple of people here, gazpacho is considered to be a soup, but it's technically made with a fruit, which is a tomato. So can soups contain fruit? Do soups need to be liquid? Well, what about frozen soup? Does it stop being soup because it's frozen? And so on and so forth. So you're tasked with a number of questions that eventually reveal to yourself that even a basic macro category like soup are very difficult to define and to delineate with precision. Obviously, the joke here is on Wittgenstein, but you don't need to know that. When somebody asks you to define a game, you're in a similar situation. There's a macro category of things that look like one another, but the definition is shifting in history and very subjective, and never with a single definition you can capture the whole phenomenon. If you're interested, that is called macro categories of language, and Wittgenstein wrote extensively about it. So with the soup idea, I made it silly and practical, but it's actually a proper philosophical theory. Moving on. So we've seen that video games can be socio-political. I mean, I showed you Parable of the Polygons. There's other games that I could have raised here, brought up here, such as Cart Life. Have you played the game? It's about being an immigrant in the United States and trying to make a living. Obviously, the game is set up for you to fail, so it's also not really about your performance. There's a rhetorical point to the whole thing. Or Nova Alea, which is a game about investing in the central business district and why certain kind of activities can take place in our cities and certain others are not permitted by the economic situation in which we are at. So games that look like games use game technology, maybe give you score and drive your progress, but eventually are a commentary on a socio-political situation. They can be philosophical. I showed you a couple of examples. If more recently, David O'Reilly made a game called Everything on the philosophy of Alan Watts. You don't need to know it, but there's more games than the ones that I make. And there's also self-reflexive kind of games. As I mentioned to you, those are the three categories, right, of conceptual works. There can be games that, in a way, tell us about games or criticize, ridicule, reflect on the way we make, play, and give social value to those things we call games. This is a definition that says self-reflexive games are designed to communicate critical or satirical perspectives on how games are designed, played, sold, manipulated, experienced, and understood as social objects. I'm fond of examples. Here comes one. You might see the character of Cat Mario, also known as Siobon No Action, which is a 2007 video game that looks very much like this, which means very much like Super Mario. Proportions are Super Mario-like, directions of play, like it's inviting us to go right? Reading the game from left to right, like most games from the West, although, and Japan included, because you also read it left to right. However, this is just an impression, it's just a trick, because soon after the first scene, the game starts to infringe the kind of expectations and conventions of the platforming action genre that you see on the screen. Meaning that things will be disattended, the designer will play unfair, and certain things that were established as working previously in the game will stop working. The game will soon become very, very weird and deceptive. One of the ideas here is, for example, that you can go negatives with the lives and nobody stops you from continuing play, right? Those are like very basic assumptions that the designer will be your friend, they will be clear, they will aid you in your progress, they will be reliable in their intention, and their instruction are put into question in this game that, in a way, serves as a joke at the expenses of the player to reflect their expectations and ideas about what games are back on them. It teaches you nothing. It's a game of exceptions and frustration. Similar game that helps players reflect on what is a game, what it is like to make a game, and what does the designer owe me, is a game called The Beginner's Guide, which many of you presumably played, which is a game about exploring an aspiring designer's early work and trying to find meaning in it. And again, like, who are we as players and what do the designers owe us as players? What's our relationship like? The game puts it into questions in several ways throughout the game. So it's a game about making games that reflects on the role of the designer and the role of the player. Pretty interesting stuff. This could fall under the conceptual games, according to my small definition. And eventually, I'm going to show you one more game of mine, which is called Doors, that is designed as a self-reflective conceptual game, and maybe you will tell me whether that works for you. How much time do I have? So how slow can I take this? 5 minutes, okay. I thought I could go a little longer. Anyway, in the Doors game, you encounter about 10 or 11 freaky doors. It's a point-and-click game that takes place within a strange hotel. What does it look like? Okay, let's take this door, for example. Whoop. Okay, so the game features an investigator who's also a strange kind of thinker, who is invited to this hotel because something happened. One of the doors in the hotel disappeared, and only you can solve the problem. Okay. Fine, let's try. So the player is invited to use the cursor to open the door. I mean, it's very, I don't show everything, but it's a very simple interface that says use door. As many games that you played in the past, and especially in present times, it is fond of giving you achievements. So congratulations, it says, you opened the front door. It's not only a contemporary game, but it's also a philosophical game in a sense that it soon stops on its track and say, like, wait a minute, did you open the door? Because as far as we are concerned, this character, I mean, in the world of fiction, opened the door. It was not the player who opened the door. Like, we're on two different fictional layers. At most, it can be said that you moved around the cursor and clicked and stuff to suggest the player character to perform certain actions. And if we really want to be thorough with this, the thing that you clicked on is not even a door, it's a group of pixels meant to resemble a door in a sort of play world. Am I making sense here? So instead of just taking like, yeah, I just opened the door, no, actually the situation is a lot harder and a bit different. And according to this view here, an in-game door is first and foremost like a fictional prop that we take as a door and act on it as a door. So instead of saying you open the front door, perhaps a more philosophical point would be that you, player, taking the role of the protagonist of the game, use your cursor to interact with a group of pixels, which it can be said that it's a virtual model of a door because it's interactive computer generation representation of a door, and thus what you've done is fictionally open a door that is represented to exist within the world of a game. This would be a more conceptually approved definition of what just happened. So you see, like, the very first interaction with the door already problematizes what happened here and what is a door in a game. Let's take one that is less stupid, because this is the very first one. Let's take a second door. So let's take this one, which is one of my favorite, because it's very nasty to players. Let's see. So our investigator managed to get inside the hotel and begin the investigation on the missing door, right? And like in most point-and-click adventures, you play the genre, you know what I'm talking about. You move a cursor and many things light up because they can be interacted with or they can be examined and so on and so forth. Almost everything in this funky hotel can be examined and touched or opened, closed, and so on, apart from this door here, which has no binding box. Right? So it's almost as if it were non-interactive, right? What happens when the players encounter this door is that they try to click on it, to open it, to see what's interactive about it, and then they get very, very angry because nothing is happening, right? And so the reaction that we had during playtest is like, ooh, there's a bug in the software. Could be. Or maybe just the level designer, the designer forgot to put binding boxes or active areas in the screen. So this is not working for some reason. The game proceeds and you can actually finish the game without ever figuring out what's going on with this door. And at the end of the game, you get an achievement for having interacted with a non-interactive door, right? So the point here is that the door was approached, I moved my character close to it, then I decided to put the pointer on it, and I clicked it and nothing happened. And only then I decided, and only after having interacted with it and having positioned myself next to it, it appeared as a non-interactive door. This is a response to, I don't know if you know Espen Aarseth in game studies. He wrote a very famous paper about certain doors being fictional, certain doors being virtual, in the sense that certain doors do not admit interaction and certain doors do admit interaction. We try to prove against Espen, who is the one of the people who uses this in school for his students, by the way, that, yeah, you're kind of wrong because there's some degree of interaction. Maybe they're not game-relevant interaction, but there's still something going on. Can something within a virtual world, even just represented, be truly considered to be non-interactive? Interesting question. Last door. This is a stupid door. Okay, yeah, it's also quite dark. Eventually, the investigation takes our detective down to the basement of the hotel when some of the mysteries happen. And then you can see that there's an old door here made of rickety wood and a strange lock and so on. Obviously, there's an old key to open the old door. Eventually, you find it and you open the door and this happens. So instead of opening and closing, this door falls apart. It's an old door made of crappy wood. And something else happens here, that this particular object here becomes something that you can take and use later in the adventure. So the question here would be, is this more or less realistic representation of a door? Let me ask this question differently. From a door in a game, we expect that it opens and closes, or maybe partitions part of the game from or making it accessible or not accessible. This one fell apart and instead revealed that it's made of wood and the wood can be used. Is that more of a video game door, or is that more realistic representation because the material with which it's made is relevant to the adventure? Again, a question that we cannot ask on our feet because we do not know exactly what we expect and what is supposed to be a door or an object in a game. To conclude very rapidly, this is an example of a conceptual use of games because we have first-hand direct experience with a certain game element, a question that is implicitly or sometimes explicitly asked the player. And eventually, that's an interesting little thing. In the description of that door, there's also references to the academic sources that explain or counter that point. In fact, it looks like this when you decide to go into an achievement, right? So you can go and read what we said and what is possible and what the controversy is. So this makes not only the game a conceptual work by the definition that I've given you, which you can take or leave, but it also enters in an academic discourse. So it's a work that weaves together, contradicts, comments upon academic papers. So at what point could you say that this game is not an academic work, right? So it contains, let's say, philosophical reflections on game studies insights. It relates critically with its sources. So I would say, why not considering those kind of outputs, similar maybe to the one that our friend yesterday produced, different from an academic output. And there was an interesting discussion yesterday with Richard and Emily here, in which Richard said, like, okay, yeah, but I mean, there's a difference here because in movies and books, we know who the authors are, right? Whereas in games, sometimes, like, we have large collaboration and it's hard to pinpoint creative responsibilities on whoever has done that. So maybe that is a little bit of a difficulty in considering this to be an authored academic piece. And I have two little answers to that question. The first one is being, well, as far as Google Scholar picks it up and I get citation for the games, to me it counts like an academic output. But more precisely answering Richard's question, since 2016, there are, in game studies, discussion about what is the definition of authorship, what's the role of the author, and how we cite and reference digital games as cultural objects. This in particular is my little contribution to this one, but for example, the work of Stephanie Jennings is particularly interesting, of Noah Wadip-Fraun and Eric Kaltman are also quite crucial. There's a group of people within game studies working precisely on that question. What's the role of the author? When do we cite an author singularly, or when do we instead cite a collective? What are the procedures to do both? And you understand that until very recently, this was not discussed. So if you write your thesis on games, how do you cite the games? That's like, okay, we were in trouble. Every journal you went to, they had different requirements. Some would treat it like a, I don't know, piece of software, common, for example, in computer science. Some would treat it as a work of art. Some would treat it as a toy, right? So until recently, we do not have journal standards in game studies about how to reference these works as not only conceptual works, but also materials that can be academic material and can be cited within arguments or as examples and so on and so forth. So if you're interested, I could continue on this path. I could be done here, but I have a secret little extra in case you want it, but you might want to ask for it. So for now, I hope that I introduced this idea of conceptual games and maybe suggested that games are or can be indeed part of our academic output, especially in a community like yours. I don't remember your name exactly, Prasad. Yeah, Prasad, for example, I know that you introduce playable parts in your thesis or games within your thesis. So some of you are already working in that direction, if I'm not mistaken. And pretty sure that Luisa also is hoping to go in that direction or is already going in that direction. So hopefully this helps, and I'm very happy to share information about how we at the University of Malta in particular archive and reference games as part of our daily practice. So if that was useful for you, I'm very glad. And if you want a little extra, I can give it to you later. Okay. Thank you.